everybody, and welcome to this episode of Inside Insights, a podcast powered by Zappy. My name is Ryan, and I'm your host. And I am joined today by Richard Shotton, a behavioral scientist and the author of The Choice Factory and Illusion by Choice. I had the chance to meet Richard properly a couple weeks ago, where he gave an amazing keynote at our Connected Insights conference. So I had to have him on the podcast so we could talk behavioral sciences and technology together. Richard, thanks for joining.
Oh, thank you for having me. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure. If you've read, I was giving Richard shit about this earlier. If you've read his books, you know he drinks lager. I also drink lager. And here in America, people often judge me for this. You know, like the craft beer movement. Many years ago, I would have told you I was a Miller Lite drinker. That's what I like to drink. And one of our salespeople said to me, "You can't tell the difference." And I was like, I sure can. Now, I had heard from a professor at university, people don't drink beer, they drink advertising, which I thought was interesting. So we put this to the test. We got 4 red cups, and we poured Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors Light, and there was one more, and I couldn't tell the difference. The bet we made was if he was right, I had to switch to Bud Light in perpetuity. So that was about 8 years ago.
Yeah,
And
I'm guessing where this is going. Yeah.
Yeah, now I drink Bud Light.
I mean, it's definitely that point about you drink the advertising is backed up by the evidence. There's an awful lot of experiments that show what we expect to taste affects our actual experience. So one of the famous studies is by Raghunathan, I think so, McCombs Business School at Texas. And
Okay.
he gets a group of Americans and serves them a buffet of Indian food and gets them to rate all the different elements, the samosas, the curries, the naans, but doesn't care about any of the ratings. They're all just a sideshow, a smokescreen. The only thing he cares about is their ratings of the lassi. So the mango lassi, this is an Indian yogurt drink.
Okay.
And half of the people he has told the lassi is an unhealthy drink. Half the people he's told it's a healthy drink. And when he looks at the ratings, he finds that those who think it's healthy rate the product significantly worse than those who think it's unhealthy. So the people who think it's unhealthy rate it about 55% higher. And his argument is, especially in America, and you don't find this effect in France. I would suggest you probably do find it in the UK, where I'm from. But in America, there is assumption that healthy is going to be bad tasting. So people have this negative attitude that becomes self-fulfilling, and it affects the actual taste of the product. So his study was on labeling, but you find the same things around price, brand, receptacle people drink through. However you set a positive or negative expectation from the surrounding information, it will affect the actual taste of the product. So yeah, I think that lager test is a really interesting one. People think they make a judgment on taste. Half the time, it's on superfluous factors.
It is. It's also the study reminds me of like how even as adults you can see your inner child come through. Like, you ever tell kids we need to eat healthy tonight, and the first thing they do is complain. Like, I don't want to eat vegetables. And vegetables are delicious. But of course, as a kid, you don't know that. So it isn't that sort of expectancy is interesting to me. It probably explains why so many people drink matcha, because for the life of me, I can't explain why anybody would consume that, but it's healthy.
Yeah, the other bit there, you could say, well, maybe the fact it tastes foul, and I don't want to, say anything controversial here, but as far as I'm concerned, it tastes like you're drinking grass. I would imagine the assumption works the way around. Well, if it tastes this bad, surely it's good for me. So yeah, these are fascinating findings that brands can use. If you're a brand, be very, very careful about telling people if you've taken out the additives or the sugar, because people will think you've made the product taste worse, even if there's no change of flavor. So you might just want to be silent about it. Or if you're a health brand, maybe don't put chemicals in to try and mask some of the unpleasant flavors. Actually, that bad taste might emphasize your kind of credibility as being a health brand.
Your whole point. Yeah, it's interesting because like a lot of times we test new ideas all the time, and I can't tell you how many people upload ideas with like every bullet point imaginable to describe their thing. And I think you offer some really great advice here. Like, be really choiceful of not only what you say, because there's only so much real estate and headspace, but the impact what you say is going to have on people.
There's an amazing campaign from Canada. I don't know how well known it is in the US. It's not very well known here in the UK. There's a cough syrup called Buckley's, and they had this amazing journey from being a small player to rocketing in the 1990s. And that was when they changed their slogan. And the slogan was, it tastes awful and it works. They emphasized the foul taste because they knew people assume there are trade-offs. And if you emphasize it's really bad tasting, rather than like most brands would do, try and hide it away, people
Smart.
assumed, well, if it's that bad tasting, it's going to be amazingly potent.
Yeah, that's really smart. Okay, so I want to have two sides of a conversation with you. The first is inside of companies. The second is how companies show up with customers. So every company out there that you and I consult with and do business with is on some digital transformation journey somewhere. And they're having varying degrees of success, despite the fact that they all say they're doing it and they're all still customer centric. And a lot of folks that listen here to the podcast are people who are trying to drive change to elevate customer centricity in their business and ultimately to elevate the impact they can have. And I think a lot of people listening would rather focus on behavioral sciences, strategy, and growth all day than running market research. And I sort of live by the worldview, if you get the stack in place to do market research, then the really smart insights people can do the fun work. But people, process, change sort of get in the way. And so what I wanted to do is have a chat with you about where we can apply behavioral sciences at work to better drive change in our jobs. And I think we could probably a few different principles we can talk through, but I guess I'll turn it to you. What are some pieces of advice that you'd call to people's attention if they're either being forced to change or trying to drive change themselves?
Yeah. The first general point I'd make is the insights into consumers that behavioral science generates. Generally, they're just as relevant for professionals. So probably the most famous body of ideas in behavioral science is this idea of social proof. If you want to change behavior, emphasize that it's a popular behavior, lots of people are doing it. And that's been proven again and again and again in the consumer world. But it's just as powerful amongst professionals. There's a 2018, might be 2019 study by the Behavioural Insights team and the Australian government, where they tried to persuade doctors to give out fewer antibiotics because there's these huge long-term health risks. And sometimes they sent out a letter saying, don't give out so many antibiotics, it's really bad. Here's all the bullet point reasons why it's going to cause a problem. And there was a 3.2% reduction in prescription rates. Other people, and we're talking a large sample by this, it's 6,000 people, so it's not a massive sample issue. Yeah. Other doctors would send exactly the same educational message, but they added one line saying, you are giving out more antibiotics than 85% of other doctors. And when they did that, there was a 9.3% reduction in prescription rates. So even amongst this group, these doctors, even people who define themselves as rational, sensible, logical-based decision makers, even they are deeply, deeply influenced by behavioral biases. So I think the first thing you've got to do, if you want to change the behavior of others, don't think all these studies that have worked on consumers are irrelevant and I can't use them when I'm trying to persuade my colleagues. They're just as relevant trying to persuade your colleagues. And I would say, that social proof point is definitely something that can practically be applied in your colleagues. If you think about most attempts to change behavior in an office, they fall guilty of using social proof in the wrong way. So what a lot of campaigns do internally is say to people, none of you lot are filling your timesheets out, or no one is undertaking research in the way that they should. The danger of that is what you've got out and done is use social proof, but exactly the wrong direction. You have emphasized that lots of people are misbehaving, and all the evidence from Cialdini and others suggests that if you emphasize the scale of the problem and how many people are misbehaving, you remove a sense of transgression and you make it even more likely that behavior will happen. So the first thing to do, I would say, is make sure, whatever you want to encourage people to do, make sure you emphasize the volume of people who are already positively doing it, not the volume of people who are misbehaving.
It makes sense and it resonates with me. I've had the benefit of helping a lot of companies use technologies better. And I think one of the principles I've always thought is go where there's momentum first. And so if you can get the United States, China, Mexico, US to adopt, at some point when you're sat with your French colleagues, you can say, you can use this, right? Exactly what you're saying. Hey, did you know that you're actually the only region who's not leaned into our program yet? And that creates a sense of FOMO that is real.
Yeah, and you can see people doing that on a wide scale. So I would think Zoom's a nice example. If you look at a lot of Zoom advertising, they no longer talk about the magic quadrant or whatever they used to. They talk about the millions of users.
Yeah.
But when they first launched, they of course had a problem that they didn't have millions of users, or by definition. So what they did was pick a single sector that they could quickly scale in. They picked education, and rather than charging $9.99 a month, it was 99 cents. So they gave this ridiculously good value deal to educational bodies. Then, when they've got momentum, they could talk about being the leading educational provider, and that made them even more appealing in that sector. And then once they'd got a decent weight of users, they could just then go out and use that number to appeal to other sectors.
But there's also a really interesting lesson there of the inclusion. You give out more than 86% is better than saying tisk tisk, you're bad. And that brings me to something I'd love for you to explain a little bit to me. So I've fallen guilty of confirmation bias. And I see a lot of, and I see it, right? Like I end up surrounding myself with heads of insights who also believe the same thing.
Yeah.
And then I see them fall victim to, why doesn't everybody get this? Or I'll give you like a real example. We created Insights Maturity Framework for our book. And it was one of the most powerful things that I've done because it reminded me, 70%, so there's 3 levels of maturity that we articulate. 70% of the people that we do business with are still at level 1. And I had this, oh my God, I've had this blind spot for 5 years moment while I was literally authoring a book. And it's like, ever since then, it's really helped me like better meet people where they are. But I guess if you're running a department and you're driving change, how do you avoid the bias that you're just seeing, and you're seeing things that you naturally agree with, and don't miss where the dissonance actually is so that you can address it?
Yeah. Because there's almost 2 different bias, I think, at play here. So there's the false consensus. This was first
Yeah.
experimented on by Lee Ross, I think, back in 1977. And then there's confirmation bias. The false consensus effect is essentially we assume that others are more like us than they are. We assume that the beliefs, the attitudes, the experience we have isn't universal. We're not stupid, but we assume it's more commonplace than it likely is. So for Ross's study, it's quite a
Interesting.
clever thought experiment. Recruits a group of people and says, look, imagine you've driven through a 30-mile-an-hour zone in your car and you were doing 35 miles an hour. You're stopped by the police, you're given a ticket, rightfully. But when you get home, you look at the ticket and you realize there are all sorts of administrative errors. So the make and model's wrong, the date's wrong, all sorts. So you could probably appeal it and you might get off. So the first question is, would you appeal because you've got this chance to avoid paying a fine? Or would you accept it because you were doing the illegal deed? So people answer. And then the next question, this is the nub of the experiment. He says, what do you think other people would do? And what he finds is if people would appeal the fine, they assume the majority would also appeal. Whereas if people would contest the fine, they assume the majority would contest the fine. So what he argues is that whatever attributes we have, we overestimate their popularity. So if we vote for Kennedy, it's not that we think every other voter votes Kennedy. We will assume that far more Americans do that than is actually the case. So for this one, I think the key point is recognizing that we are not the market and trying to actively go out and challenge our opinions and look for ways for putting them to the test. Because what often people do is assume that their behavior is commonplace and therefore they don't even consider testing it. So I think that's your first issue. The second issue is what you talk about is confirmation bias, which is even more pernicious, which is an argument that Leon Festinger did an awful lot of experimentation around. And his argument was we don't interpret information neutrally. We interpret it through a lens of our feelings of the communicator. So if someone you dislike tells you an argument, you spend an awful lot of time thinking of mental arguments about why that information just isn't true. But if you get exactly the same message from someone you admire, you're far more predisposed to it. Now, Festinger didn't just isolate the problem, he also looked at potential solutions, potential moments when people were more open to change. So it's a slightly strange study, but Festinger recruits members of college fraternities. So these were slightly controversial educational bodies that people could join. He gets members of those fraternities to come to his lab where he plays them a audio argument about why those fraternities are morally wrong. Some people just listen to the audio argument with no distractions. Other people listen to the audio argument whilst they are forced to watch a silent movie. And when later on Festinger questions all the participants about how far they've changed their opinion, it's the group who were distracted who were more likely to change than the group who gave their full attention. And Festinger's argument is the brain is amazing at generating counter arguments to maintain its existing point of view. But if some of that ability is taken up, if you're doing another task at the same time, if some of that ability is taken up, and therefore you become a little bit more persuadable. So Festinger comes up with this very counterintuitive idea, which is if you want to challenge rejectors and get them to change their opinion, actually, it's moments of distraction that you should be focused on. So from a brand perspective, if you want to win over consumers who reject your brand, don't reach them in the cinema when they're giving you their full attention. Reach them on the radio when they're driving or doing the housework. It leads to a very counterintuitive media choice in that particular respect.
That's interesting. So let's talk about that inside of business.
Mm.
I hear a lot of leadership rhetoric that is like repeat, 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 jam these messages down people's throat, have 2 or 3 messages. The CEO's got like chief repetition officer in their title, right?
Yeah.
So I'm leading somebody and I want them to stop being a procurement manager, let the tools do the work so I can focus them on being in more strategic meetings. So bring me into that paradigm. How can we do that? Like, where's someone distracted in a B2B context? Because I find it really fascinating. And I agree with it. Like I'm somebody who like my subconscious does most of the work for me. So my best ideas come when I'm not working. So I'm with you on that because it allows me to think and process. But yeah, let's like unpack that a bit.
So I think there are 2 ways of using that insight. The first is I think the point around distraction is probably better used for consumers.
Consumers,
The
okay.
point around confirmation bias, though, I think there's a different set of tactics you could use to get around it. So, remember we said Festinger's argument, essentially, we interpret a message through this lens of based on our opinion of the communicator. Well, if you accept that it's not what's said, but who's saying it, that can be much more easy to find in B2B. It means if you have a fractious relationship with a head of IT, you could tell him exactly the same logical argument and it would fall on deaf ears. But if you can persuade someone who's much more friendly with the head of IT to be the communicator for that argument, well, then you'd have a very different impact. And that principle has been tested repeatedly. So the original ideas were tested by Hovland and Weiss back in 1951.
Interesting.
And what they did was find a controversial question of the day. So one of the questions was, do you think America can build a nuclear-powered submarine in the next 12 months? And people would either say yes or no. They then invite those people back to the lab in 4 days' time. And when their participants arrived at the lab, there was a page of A4 paper waiting for them. And on that, there was a very cogently argued opinion about why the participant was completely wrong. So if I said, yes, a submarine can be built, it'd be a very powerful argument about why that just wasn't realistic. They then asked everyone if they'd changed their opinion. But the twist was sometimes the argument came from a credible source, Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist. Sometimes, in this case, it would come from an uncredible source, like Pravda, the Russian newspaper. And what the psychologists found was if the argument came from a credible source, 23% of people changed their mind, low credibility source, it was 7%. So you've got this 3.5-fold swing in persuasiveness of a piece of message. Crucially, exactly the same message. All that's changing is the supposed author. So their argument is it's not what you say. Often it's more important about who says it. So thinking far more carefully about, well, who would be the right messenger for which particular audience? That, I think, would be the B2B angle.
I think it's spot on. I see so often a leader bring in somebody from outside to inspire their team to give the same damn message they gave, and it cuts through, probably in the same 3-to-1 ratio that the study found. And so it's a really good practice. And I think, like thinking of my audience, insights marketing people, it's a community of really like-minded, intellectual people. And so I encourage y'all lean into that, because bringing in Richard to help your marketer better think of behavioral sciences, if you've got a CMO who just wants to put all the features in, will help that person see it maybe better than you can even explain them. And so that's I like the
Yeah.
intentionality of that.
You mentioned that example because later work suggests there's three types of messages that tend to be effective. And it's hard to get one that embodies all three qualities, but the three are credibility. So Robert Oppenheimer is credible in that he obviously has this huge physics knowledge. Neutral. So that's your point about if the CEO wants to say something, and if he argues it directly, everyone will think, well, he would say that, wouldn't they? Or she would say that, wouldn't she? It's in her probably financial interest to say it. If you get someone external who looks like they haven't got any skin in the game, suddenly they become a bit more believable. And then the third, which is a slightly different angle, is relatability. So we're most influenced by people who we see are similar to ourselves. So if you're trying to gauge how effective a message will be, think about neutrality, credibility, or relatability.
It's gold. The other thing, I think, like for everybody listening, you didn't get into insights by accident necessarily because you're a curious person. But the point you made a while ago, I just wanted to comment on it about, I'll say it in my own words, but essentially this projection of I'm in this situation, I feel and act one way, and therefore I expect you to act that way. And I'll just be vulnerable with everybody. I've gotten burnt by that bias before. Like, oh, I can't believe when so-and-so was in that corner, they behaved that way, and I would have never done that. Well, they're not you, right? And so I think it behooves you to pay more attention to understand your colleagues and their biases so that because you shouldn't assume blindly that they're going to agree with you. And I think
Yeah,
a lot of us do it. I've fallen victim of this more times than I care to admit.
absolutely. It would certainly be victim. So we had the Brexit vote, I think it was in 2016, where Britain had a referendum on whether to leave the European Union or not. I was a voter for Remain. And generally, you see the key drivers, if you're going to try and guess if someone's a vote, would be education level and age. So most of the people I knew were all voting Remain. I kind of blindly thought, well, this is going to be, easy victory. Now, I'm sure the polls are wrong. And then obviously when the results come in, it squeaks the other way around. So yeah, I've completely, even though knowing about these biases, still fall victim to them myself.
Yeah, the Brexit election was not too dissimilar in nature to what happened in the first Trump election, right? I mean, I think in that case, and it's happening here in America now, you get a few beers in someone and then they go, I'm embarrassed to say this, but, and that's why I think I know we've talked about this, like measuring what people actually do and why they do it needs to be balanced with what do they say, because sometimes they're going to lie to you. And this is a good example of that. And you're like, in the Brexit case, it was maybe less polarizing because of the geographic distribution of where the votes came from. But at least here in the United States at that point, it's a bit of a taboo thing. And it was like, oh shit, like people did vote for him.
Yeah, yeah.
It was really interesting. Again,
It's a real problem in the UK for the advertising industry because they're not reflective, or we're not reflective of the country. A media owner
good point.
called Reach who owned some big newspapers. They did a survey after Brexit about who people voted for. 97% of the people they surveyed in ad agencies voted Remain. So 97% Remain, 3 Leave. But the actual election result, I think, was 52% Leave, 48% Remain. Absolutely out of kilter. So to me, the false consensus effect is also a big argument for diversity. You can't just expect people to be empathetic completely. You need to get this variety of experiences and backgrounds, worldviews in a group, because otherwise you have massive blind spots, and we're often blind to our blind spots.
We are. I mean,
Mm.
it's a pretty famous internal example, but we had a campaign that we were evaluating for one of our customers. And it was not an ad that resonated with population. And the CEO of the company was pissed. Like, I love this idea. I don't understand why this didn't do well. And their insights person was like, well, why do you think that? And he was like, I tested it at a cocktail party with my friends this weekend.
Yeah.
Idea. And the point was like, yeah, but you don't sell your product to those people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like, unless this is a product exclusively for them, don't be surprised when Joe Schmo down the street doesn't like it. I talk a lot about the consumer being in the room. That's why I do what I do, because it levels the playing field to get, if you have, and it assumes you're talking to a representative source of people, but it actually says, oh no, this is, if you're trying to sell to these people and it doesn't resonate with them, you might want to change it up,
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
The other thing, I don't know if you've ever read this article, but Harvard Business Review did this, and I want to say this is like 10 years ago, but they wrote this op-ed and it was essentially saying, use water cooler gossip to your advantage. And it was
Okay.
a
No, no, I
similar
haven't seen
point of
this.
when someone, it got me
Yeah.
thinking when you were talking, like someone might be more susceptible to change their mind when they're not paying attention. And then if you think about like communities and groups of people, there are official leaders and there are, I call them locker room leaders, people
Yeah.
that when everybody's like, when everything's a mess, they call and say, what do you think? And I read that article probably 8, 9 years ago, and I have really changed my behavior from worrying about office politics and gossip to embracing it. Because if you know who the key people are and you know that that happens, well, then they can help. You can say, hey, this is what I'm working on. And when they're talking to people, it comes out.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. The other one that, like, thinking about this whole point of confirmation bias and how you get around it, the other one that sparked, and this is a different angle, but I think solves a similar problem, is there is a wonderful psychologist, I think it's the University of Bath, Robert Heath, and he wrote a
Mm.
book called Seducing the Subconscious. And he talks about the Festinger experiment and how people are more open to changing these deep-seated beliefs when they're distracted. But he takes a very different angle about harnessing it. And he uses the example of the British Airways ads in the 1990s. It's quite an old book. So this is a time when British Airways had a poor reputation for quality.
Mm.
And they changed that not by going out and saying, oh, we've now got amazingly luxurious seats and lots of leg room. So what they did was communicate far more obliquely. So every single ad had the Delibes flower duet from the opera Lakme. It's a hauntingly beautiful bit of music. And Heath's argument is, look, classical music has all these connotations, so it kind of clearly conveys quality, but they never directly say it. And because you never directly say it, you then don't you then don't generate these counter arguments. Now, that principle of the body language of an advert being very important for rejectors, getting around confirmation bias, I think you could probably apply that in B2B settings, in internal settings. Because what you could say is, look, it's not just the logical argument you make in your deck, it's how slick the graphics are, it's whether you come across as likable, it's all those seemingly frivolous elements of the presentation that are actually effective because you're communicating indirectly, and that doesn't suffer from confirmation bias so much.
It's so true. And I forget the exact principle that you talked about in Choice Factory, but this last point that you made, it shows up when you know something through and through. I mean, anybody listening, you ever sit there and you deliver a presentation and it's a topic left, right, center, always, and you leave and you feel misunderstood. And it's like, I forget the name of the bias that you talked about, but it was essentially the curse of knowing too much.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I think if you're really close to something, you have to be really conscious of the fact that just because you know everything doesn't mean they do. And it's almost like tailor back what you say and be mindful of your graphics and the credibility and the way it comes across. It resonates with me because I've been guilty of it. Like I understand, like in my case, I understand my customers so much. Why doesn't everybody do it? And so that's a limiting factor if that's your mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely fair.
All right, so I want to transition a little
Mm.
bit in our last few minutes together. We're seeing advertising, music, videos, content all get created quickly using language models, imagery, and this is going to keep continuing. I mean, if you're inside a big business, there's a cost takeout, there's an efficiency associated with producing things. Consumers, I'm one of them, you're one of them, and I've seen this come through with some of our work. Their bullshit meter's high now. I was listening to something today and I went and triangulated it with 3 different sources because I didn't believe it. So brands are going to want to focus on the productivity gains of creating with AI at a time when human beings are more skeptical to let things into their home than ever. So what advice do you have for a brand to balance the productivity benefit with the wonderful opportunity to be distinctive, unique, relevant in a community today?
Yeah. So I think you can attack that problem from the both ends. So there's firstly, how do you maximize the productivity gains from AI? Because psychologists would say it's not as simple as just increasing the effectiveness of the algorithm. So there is a brilliant study, 2022 study by Fabrizio Dell'Acqua, who I think is at Harvard Business School.
Mm-hmm.
He recruits 180 recruitment consultants and gets each one to look at 44 CVs, and they have to rate these CVs on their mathematical ability. So it's a quantifiable thing that he can objectively score. And the information they need is slightly hidden. Now, some people get an algorithm that he refers to as bad AI. So it's 75% accurate. Some get an algorithm that has been designed to be 85% accurate, which he refers to as good AI. Now, logically, you would think that the people that have the better algorithm would get better results. That is not what happens. The people with the supposedly better algorithm get worse results. And Dell'Acqua's argument for this is when AI crosses a certain threshold, when it becomes more and more useful, there is a danger of, in his words, people falling asleep at the wheel. There is a danger of thinking, well, I'm not needed here. My expertise is needed. I'm just going to cut and paste the answers into the spreadsheet. So his argument is when you are judging a model, don't just think about improving the model in isolation. You've got to judge it as how do I make the AI plus human combination as strong as possible, and do everything you can to remind that their discretion, their intelligence, their judgment still has a role, and they cannot abrogate responsibility. So I think there are psychological principles that can definitely apply in that productivity part of the equation.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it also, it's how I think of it. Like I use it to enable me a lot, but it's me and the AI. I'm never copying and pasting stuff. But I think it's interesting to transition to brands. I have a high bullshit filter personally. Like I don't want to be written for. I want to speak for myself. Like it's a really interesting tension. Okay, so we're using machines and people. Agreed.
Yeah.
How do we balance the authenticity that consumers, I believe, expect now more than ever?
Yeah, I think there is a danger that if you just use ChatGPT in quite a formulaic way, you come up with formulaic answers. So I think there's a couple of points you could do there. There's a wonderful book by Ethan Mollick called Co-Intelligence. And in it, he talks about in your prompts, don't just ask a question, tell the AI to adopt a persona. So maybe telling it to, well, as if you were an amazingly creative advertising exec, what answers do you come up? Or if you were a behavioral scientist. So I think trying to ensure that the prompts aren't, you move from a generic question to a prompt that more closely reflects what you need. That differentiates it, makes it all individual. And then I think the second interesting area would be if you use a standard model that's been trained on the same information as everyone else, you're going to get standardized answers. It's a prediction machine. If you train it on your own discrete body of knowledge, maybe a corpus of 25 behavioral science books, that's going to lead to a different output. So I think you can start making some decisions that will mean you're less generic, less bland through those two tactics potentially.
I agree with you. I mean, so there's a system called Jasper.ai, and our marketing organization here uses it. And I just told you I don't like to be written for, but I actually do get written for a lot for two reasons. There's a woman named Katie Sweet who helps produce this show, who I trust intimately. We've worked together forever. One thing, she's very busy. She's in high demand. So we've taught the Jasper system my tone. Conversational, non-corporate, direct, sometimes swears, etc. So with those, and I was trying to find it while we were talking, but with those 6 or 7 prompts, she can very quickly produce something that I'm not going to have 20 edits for. And I think that's teaching your brand. And so that plus the fact that agents, I believe, are the new software, and agents can be codified to understand your supply chain, your consumer data, what you know about your retail environment, what you know has previously worked in advertising. And if you can harness that, to me, that's why consumer data businesses, consumer insights departments are adopting AI faster than a lot of other parts of the organization, because the data is useful to augment what we already know with language models. So there's something really interesting in that.
Yes. There is as you were saying that, you then get a conundrum of how open am I about something being generated by AI? Because there's an amazing set of studies by Andrea Morales, who's at one of I think by the University of Southern California, but 2005 study. And she coins this phrase, the illusion of effort. So a really simple study, recruits a group of people, everyone's in market for a house, and she shows them 10 houses that meet their requirements. Twist in the experiment, some people are told that the realtor generated the list quickly, it took an hour and they used a computer. Other group are told the estate agent went to realtor in American terms, went to loads of effort, 9 hours, and did it manually. Now, when the group rate the realtor later on, the people who think the realtor went to low effort rate them at 50 out of 100. The other group rate the realtor at 68 out of 100. So you've got this 36% improvement in quality ratings. And again, people are judging exactly the same output, but according to Morales, what they are faced with is a complex question. Working out whether a realtor is good or bad quality is a complex question. And when people are faced with complex questions, they tend to replace them almost without knowing it with simpler questions that give them an almost as good answer. And the simple question is not, is this a good realtor? It's how much effort did they go to? So we use effort as a proxy for quality. Now, the problem with AI is if it speeds things up, if you're working on an organization and you are churning out work faster and faster, unless you put in counterbalancing measures, people, even if there is no objective decline in your quality, they will judge it as worse. So if you're going to speed up, make sure that everyone knows that there have been lots of hours putting into setting up the algorithm correctly, putting the processes in place. You've got to make sure that they know that effort has gone on, even if it's not a kind of immediate point of response.
I love it, because it's almost like, I have this constant tension, because I'm acutely aware of this, because my company sells to academic researchers.
Yeah.
And I remember when we first started doing Zappy, I'd get 1 in every 2 phone calls. There's no way this could be good research. You did it too quickly.
Yeah.
And we had to really, I remember this is a 9-year-old thing now, but we had to really overcompensate by that.
Yeah.
This is how we get data. And these are all the statistical models we use. And we're crunching 10,000 data sets all at once. And it's those subtle things that make people say, oh, got it. All right, this is legitimate. And it was legitimate, but the point wasn't that. It was, this is too good to be true, and therefore it must not be quality. So this has been really fun. You're, I think, one of the only podcast guests I've had where I leave with more ideas than I came with. So thank you. I was noticing this when you were at our conference. I had like 6 pages of notes, because like when you talk about studies and behavioral science theories, you can immediately apply it to your world and your business. And I don't think we study the science enough. And so I just want to say thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of everybody, and really citing so many wonderful studies and bringing it to life in such a digestible way. I couldn't recommend more Richard's book, The Choice Factory. You can get it anywhere books are sold. And Richard, if people want to get in touch with you to talk more, what's the best way to reach you?
LinkedIn or Twitter. So my Twitter handle's @Shotton. If they send me a DM, I'll get back to them.
Yeah. Perfect. Richard, thank you so much for taking the time. This was really fun.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Good to see you.
And thanks for listening, everybody.